Hi, guys. Welcome to another episode of Futureproof, the podcast. As you know, on the podcast, I speak with a number of leading automotive executives, guys that have really focused on organizational transformation, future-proofing their businesses moving forward, as well as really driving that leadership culture within organizations. And I'm extremely excited today to have my guest on the show. I'd like to introduce to you guys Donald James. Don, most recently of Joyson Safety Systems as the president of Joyson. So I'll give you the floor to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Taylor. I appreciate it. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners today. A little bit about my background. First of all, I'm a Detroit guy. That's the first thing to understand. Born and raised in the Detroit area, and pretty much automotive running through my veins for the last 20 plus years. With that being said, I started off my career in a very humble way in automotive. I started off in customer service. I always like to tell that story as well as to your listeners because a lot of times you'll get folks on here that are CEOs and presidents, and they never really highlight where they started. Yeah, and I started from really the ground floor, answering the telephones. Thank you for calling Federal Mogul. How can I take your order? It taught me a lot. I always share that because I came up through the ranks and I had to really and it's important also from a leadership perspective that you understand that you shouldn't skip steps, right? So I started off in customer service, went into commercial on the commercial side and the sales and project management side, and then I elevated my career as a sales director after leaving Federal Mogul. Worked at Continental AG for roughly 15 years, and at that had various roles. One in the aftermarket business and the OEM business. I actually helped start up the aftermarket business in North America for Conti. I then went into commercial sales on the OEM side, ran a huge portfolio for their brake business on the sales side. And then I moved my family to Europe for a number of years. So I stayed in Europe about 4 years in Germany. I ran a global business for Conti, came back to the States, took on a bigger role as a vice president within Conti, and then just recently as the president of Joyson Safety Systems, which was, for your listeners, former Takata and KSS merger, and dealing with the challenges and helping change and turn around that business there. So I would say always progressing in my career, started off in a humble way, and I call myself the turnaround specialist. But more importantly, for your listeners, is that I don't consider myself as someone that's in the automotive business. I'm in the leadership business, and that's really what I like to focus my attention on. I think from a higher degree, I'm more so focused on leadership and really helping people and developing people along the way. So that's a little bit about myself. And once again, it's a pleasure to be a part of the podcast today. Thank you.
No, I second that, Don. It's a pleasure to have you on. But let's jump right into it then. You was at Joyson, obviously. We all know the situation that happened with Takata previously, the issues in terms of airbags, etc. So when you was there most recently, are you still overcoming that situation, or now with the kind of change of brand that's kind of being forgot about?
Right, right. Absolutely. I mean, from my side, the more important is to, under my assignment with Joyson was to help change around that situation. And more importantly for me, Taylor, I would say the biggest topic that I had to overcome was not necessarily the past issues with the company from a quality perspective or the merger of former Takata and KSS. The main topic was culture. And really think about the dynamic. You had really, if I had to say, capital ownership, majority Chinese ownership. You had really a former culture that was more Japanese centric with Takata, and then you had an American company in KSS. So imagine merging all of those different puzzle pieces together. In addition to that, the business models were totally different, right? So they had regional operations that were more regional business, and they were ran in that way. And to bring all of those things together was quite challenging. But the overreaching and overarching approach is really tackling the culture change and the things that needed to happen from a quality mindset perspective within that business. And that was really my main focus and my main contribution to help change that over the last years.
Okay, and obviously the cultural transformation is something, but what other key challenges did you face within the role, being responsible for the Americas?
Well, for me, it was more or less the restructuring, right? So when you bring all those organizations together, there's a huge task to look at, and more or less, I hate to think of the world as black and white, but in some cases, when you think about a merger, there's some winners and some losers, and within the organizational structure, and this is the tough side of leadership, right? We have to make some tough decisions about how to restructure and lean out the organization, and then also what plants and what operational locations will survive, and which ones that we would have to more or less consolidate and close. I would say biggest challenge when doing that restructuring over the last years was really alignment with the customers, because obviously when you have these different organizations, there are different approaches to even their customer and business relationships. You think about also from a technology perspective, certain things were different. So on the Takata side, you had certain operational approaches than the former KSS side, and bringing those together and getting the alignment from a customer base was also challenging. So those are the primary hurdles, and then obviously you have to keep people motivated. You have to keep really the morale at the highest level possible, and you have to get your leadership team to buy in to the cultural change and the strategic approach and the vision. And that was really the main issues and hurdles that I faced, but was quite successful in helping the team do that overall as well. It's no secret that because of past compliance issues with quality, there was also a Department of Justice monitorship over the new company, Joyson, and I'm happy to say that under my leadership, that we were able to successfully exit from that as well. So that was also a really big thing at the company I was able to achieve with the team.
Okay, oh, perfect. And then if we look at just earlier on to that, as you mentioned, spending 15, 16 years within Conti, again, globally, one of the biggest automotive suppliers there is. Again, it's still in the safety element, the hydraulic brake systems, but talk us a bit through the role there when you was responsible for the whole business within North America.
Yeah, I had two primary roles. I would say several because I had a nice career run at Conti, and it really helped develop me and taught me a lot. I would say the responsibility that I had was formerly vice president of hydraulic brake systems in the Americas, and pretty much my role and responsibility was more P&L driven, overseeing the entire business, and then taking them through a transformational change. And the primary transformational change was really market driven, and we had to adapt to that. And that was more or less adapting our business structure and business model from light car to basically light truck, or pass car to light truck. And then also more recently at Conti, overseeing the global brake business, and that really changed my mindset from let's say more of a regional approach to a global approach. And I was able to contribute and run that business there. And more or less, it was about growth because Conti, let's face it, really top company, very stable company. It was more about growth through acquisition, as well as really doing some minor restructuring, but really driving forward from a commercial perspective the growth of that business through several new launches and product development and technology advancements as well.
Okay, and do you feel your time, as you mentioned, being based within Europe with your family really helped you in terms of the cultural management and the cultural changes that you've made since?
Absolutely. I would say it was in my view one of the best career decisions that I've made. And I always when I mentor folks, the first thing is that it took me out of my comfort zone, right? So as an American guy, leadership guy, that's quite natural for me and easy for me. One of the big things is that when I moved my family to Europe, I always like to do like sort of a mind map where I draw myself in the middle, and then I have really these outliers and lines out from myself. And one of the things that I had to deal with, and actually two key things, right? The first thing is that as an American leader going into a what I would say a different culture. So Conti, as you know, German-based, German-centric organization, American leader going into that environment, trying to convince majority German, let's say, leadership that I can actually lead the organization with my American kind of leadership style and approach. That was one hurdle, and I'm quite happy to say it was quite successful. I think I was embraced because I brought a different perspective, and getting out of my comfort zone was really a key thing. But more importantly, just think about it like this, Taylor. I had to actually integrate my family. So moving them away from the United States, not having any friends, any network, you coming into a social environment that's totally different. And I always joke around. It's different than having a pretzel and beer on a business trip versus living in Germany. So living there totally different from my family, choosing the right school, the right environment, the places to live, and really integrating my family was really a key thing as well, because without that healthy family balance, there's no way you can be successful from a business perspective. So those were the two challenges. Quite a success, and as I mentioned, best career decision ever from my side to really go outside of my comfort zone, move my family outside of the country, outside of the United States, and expand my global thought process to business and leadership.
No, I understand, and I think that's something that everyone can learn from in terms of being in uncomfortable situations will help you grow. And that's obviously what's happened in this situation. But then if we go back slightly further in the sales business, so usually people may have the inclination that you have to be coming from the shop floor to be able to grow within a business and do these transformations, these restructures, but yourself coming from a sales background. So how have you found that?
Yeah, well, I think quite the opposite, right? I think that's sort of the mentality. It depends, right? Everyone has their opinion, especially from an operational perspective. If you talk about that, but what is the primary underlying thing that we're all trying to do in automotive, right? We're trying to please the customer. It all starts about understanding the customer from whatever aspect that you're coming from. My advantage was is that, as I mentioned, Taylor. I mean, my background, not only running the sales business at Conti and being commercially responsible for such a big business, roughly 2 billion in business, was more or less understanding the customer channels and how they worked. And it all started from my beginning in customer service. Part of what I learned in customer service is I had to learn all of the products in automotive. I had to learn all of the distribution channels, all of the networks, how that interaction happened between supplier and OEM, and then I used that to my advantage. So as I got each additional position, primarily in sales, and then later in general management, I knew how the business ran. I knew every aspect, whether we were talking about OEM to service, to how customers interacted, all the way to the end user. And I was exposed to a lot of things through my experience that some folks were that may only come from the shop floor would never have been in those rooms and those conversations, those business meetings, setting up those contracts, and understanding how that whole process worked. So I saw myself having a really good advantage competitively in terms of how I came up through the industry. So I look at it quite differently. I think one that has really a good intimate relationship from a customer perspective has really a key advantage to understanding how business development works. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to generate sales, gain a competitive advantage, and really align ourselves in the marketplace and grow our customer portfolio in any company. So those are the underlying themes. Yeah, not necessarily only being technically savvy or operationally savvy. You need all of that. That's very important. But the overall drivers of business, they have to understand the intimacy and the relationship from a customer perspective and how to grow that business. And that was really my competitive advantage over the years.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And then, Don, if we look at it, what actually attracted you to getting into the industry in the first place in terms of automotive?
Well, I started even before I started in automotive. I spent 1 year in investment banking. Yeah, when I got my undergrad degree from the University of Michigan, and I did not like it. Yeah, it was very stale. I was in front of a computer, and that was really for me being a Detroit guy. I said, hey, why not try automotive? And it's one of those things I always share with people that I mentor because I mean, don't be afraid to take a career change. Yeah, and I took one early on, coming from the banking industry, jumping over to automotive. And the thing that attracted me is that I wanted something a little bit more exciting. Uh, Also, I saw the transformation in automotive happening. Yeah, I thought from my perspective changes were coming. We looked at different. I looked at different technologies in the industry, and I always use this model that I look at even today, and I call it ACEs, right? So, and ACEs stands for basically autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And pretty much from my perspective, those are the things that attracted me. I really saw the future. I saw an opportunity, and also, I saw the potential in terms of new leadership and new energy that's needed, and I took full advantage of that. Right, at one point. I'm not so young anymore, but at one point, I was the young gun. I was the young guy coming in, really trying to lead the change of the new generation, of the new step within automotive, and that's really what attracted me to the business. Yeah. And then the one last thing, Taylor, I would say the dynamics of the business was quite interesting. And I learned even from my first job of how vast the automotive industry is, from aftermarket to OEM to supplier to distribution. I mean, there's so many different aspects to automotive, so many different suppliers, so many different puzzle pieces. It's a quite exciting industry to be a part of.
Okay, yeah, and as you mentioned, the ACES thing, I find that extremely interesting. So kind of delve a little bit deeper into that and how you would relate that to kind of automotive today.
Well, as I mentioned, ACE is autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. Yeah. So let's take each one. Yeah. So from the autonomous side, there's been a tremendous push, and you talk about autonomous driving from level 1 to level 5 in the industry, and we know that everyone's utopia and dream is to get to a level 5. And I think right now, Taylor, it's not a matter of if; it's just a matter of when. I believe that we need to get there, and we have to get there. Why? Because there's different market activity that's changing, different things that'll become necessary when you talk about the environmental challenges that we have globally. And then you talk about urbanization and some of the things that we know that needs to change. So I think there's a strong push there. It is the future. It is something that I believe it'll take time. Obviously, there are some things that you have to think about in terms of infrastructure and some of the newer technologies that'll be needed in order to support that. But I'm truly a believer that it's just a matter of when. Yeah, and we see the momentum happening. Yeah, the C is connected. Obviously, I'm pretty sure on your desk right now during this podcast, you probably have three different devices going where you want to stay connected at all times with those devices. And it's true about the vehicle, right? So if you look at the technology today, you'll have all these connected devices that are inside your vehicle. Your vehicle, more or less, is just a computer today. There are a lot of things that are changing and developing along the way. But not only that, there's really an advancement and what will enable really from level, let's say, 2 to level 4 of autonomy is really the connectivity between vehicles. So vehicle to vehicle, how those vehicles interact and basically communicate with each other. So that new technology will be needed within the vehicles in order to make that happen. The E for electric, that goes without saying. If you look at sustainability, and by the way, I mean, this is one of the things, I got my doctorate degree, and my main focus when I got my doctorate was in business sustainability because I saw the future. And this was over 10 years ago that I got my doctorate in that field because I knew that from an environmental perspective, that the future really has to be around sustainable energy. The combustion engine, while a great invention, let's say is outdated. If you look at the business climate, and if you think about companies, for example, like Tesla. I mean, I remember Taylor just 10 years ago. There were a lot of folks that were laughing at Tesla and they were betting against them, saying that there's no way that this could work. And while you had a lot of believers, you had a lot of folks that didn't believe. Now you see the GMs of the world saying that, hey, we're going to launch 30 new electric vehicles in the next 5 years, and we're going to expand this platform. So the time has come now to really take serious environmental concerns globally, and automotive can play a huge role in basically driving the electrification of those vehicles moving forward. And then the S for ACES is shared. And basically, that goes without saying. If you think about the urbanization that I spoke about earlier in cities and huge areas around the world, you'll definitely need to advance the practice of sharing vehicles as well. Look at companies such as Uber and Lyft. I mean, that's not going to change. That's here to stay. As a matter of fact, that'll continue to increase as you look at huge urban populations that will need to share vehicles. They're no longer the time where you'll have 3 or 4 vehicles per household. There'll be no need for that, especially if you stay in these huge urban areas of millions of people commuting every day to work or to even to leisure activity. So all of those things, to me, I call it the ACES model, will play a role into future development, future technology, and even the approach in the market. And every automotive company and organization needs to pay close attention to that. But also, one more point, Taylor, that I see is that beyond automotive, there are other applications that'll be applied, that'll be driven by the leadership that'll happen and transformation that'll happen that's already happening within automotive. So if you think about the industrial sector, if you think about the transportation and distribution sector, all of those will play off of a lot of the leadership and transformation that's happening in the automotive space. That'll certainly transfer into those different spaces as well.
Okay, and I know you touched on it, but what's your thoughts on the kind of new technologies you've got? Fully electric, you have hybridization, you have hydrogen now. What's your thoughts across kind of the three technologies or the three platforms, so to say?
Well, I would say, not new. I mean, my first response to that, these are not new. I think they're just underdeveloped. Yeah, if you look at all of these different fields, they've been worked on for a number of years. I think where we're at now, Taylor, is not necessarily looking at that as a new phenomenon, but we're looking at now what are the next steps for infrastructure? How do
Hmm.
we support that? We want things to be readily accessible. We want really the ease of operating throughout the world in our different environments and ecosystem to be equally prevalent to supporting a combustion engine, right? So we just like we pull up to a gas station, you would love to pull up to a charging station in the same manner. So I think the topic now is infrastructure, and the topic also is new battery technology. Whether you're talking about lithium ion and things like that, what are the next steps to really support the growth of electrification and some of those things? So I think really the strong push, in my view, really the winner at the end of the day will be full electrification in the automotive industry and of vehicles in the future. That will be the winner. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and do you think from a gasoline or diesel side that this will kind of peter out to nothing, or there will still be a small amount or part of the market that will still service the diesel and gasoline?
That's a great question. I don't think it'll fizzle out completely. I think that would be very naive to think that'll happen. I think you have two schools of thoughts, right? You have the extremes, and that's the one thing you have to be cautious about. You have the leaders that say, "Oh, everything is going to be electric, and we're going to fly around," but you have to still understand that this has to be affordable technology as well. You still have and it's easy for developed nations and developed countries to think in that way, but you still have underdeveloped areas of the world that may not be able to make the transformation quite as quickly as developed nations. So you'll still have a huge need in the market for developing countries. You'll always have really things that you'll need around the combustion engine that you'll still have to produce. And I look at it similar, Taylor, no different phenomenon in the world when you have majority passenger car. And when you think about the light truck market, and you don't have to go back a huge time in history to see that. You can go back 15 years and you can see that we had a lot of past car. Now you look at crossovers and you look at SUVs and you look at the road, especially in the United States, where now 70% of the market is SUVs. The same phenomenon will happen. You'll always need, let's say, the combustion engine and gasoline, and you'll still have that. But really, the focus is if you look at the environmental standards and the push and the thing that's needed, whether you talk about climate change or some of the environmental challenges that we have in the future, you have to have majority electric in the future. It doesn't mean that you'll go to zero on the combustion side, but you have to have a strong majority in the future being electric and being sustainable energy-based technology. And that transformation is happening now, and I think it's full steam ahead. That'll really happen, and that'll be driven to be the majority in the near future. I'm quite confident in that.
Okay, and in your opinion, then, in terms of the infrastructure aspect, how far out do you think we are from being able to have, you can't call them gas stations because there'd be charging stations, but kind of a charging station that can charge a car up in 5 minutes, because you have the likes of, let's say, Lucid Motors that have their vehicles coming with 500 plus miles of range. So being
Right.
able to do that, you can get across country, etc.
Yep. My view, I would say you would have that change in the next 5 to 10 years, at a maximum. I think it's going to happen very rapidly. And why do I say that? It's going to be driven, Taylor, by the huge changes that we see in really the OEM fleets and their platforms. So I'll just take GM as an example because I think as a Detroit guy, I'm really happy to see what Mary Barra and under her leadership and the GM team is doing. I mean, they're really driving forward in electrification. You see also what VW is doing on a global base. So you have these huge players that have the majority of their fleets being electric. You'll have no choice but to think about how do you change that infrastructure to support that vehicle fleet. And as that changes, obviously you'll have the changes there. So I predict next 5 to 10 years, you'll see that drastic change over the next decade, and it'll start to happen rapidly. It won't be you and I talking about, hey, when it will happen. It's starting to happen now. Next decade, we'll see that transformation occur.
And what do you think kind of the hydrogen aspect, how much of a part does this play into the future, the hydrogen power?
Yes, same. You'll need all the technologies, but I think the clear winner, in my view, will be electric vehicles, and that's really my point. I think you'll have a space for everything, but the majority, clear leader and clear winner over the next decade will be the electrification of our automotive fleets.
Okay, and I know earlier in the conversation you mentioned, let's not look at you being in the automotive business, but you're in the leadership business. So delve a little bit into that, Dom, because that's very interesting for me to understand that viewpoint of transformation, etc.
Yeah, I think first it all starts from leadership, and one of the things, one of my pet peeves, Taylor, that I always criticize the automotive industry, and it sounds strange coming from an automotive guy, majority of my career being critical, but I think in order to advance, in order to grow and develop any industry, and I consider myself one of the leaders or key leaders in the industry, you have to be also look at from a critical perspective. And one of the critical things that I have is that we do a terrible job in automotive of succession planning. And it's nothing against, and I don't want to discriminate, right? So I have to be careful. I don't want to do an ageism thing here, but really we have to develop young talent within the automotive industry. I see a lot of the older leadership still at the forefront, and quite frankly, we need new innovation, new minds, and new young leadership to come into the industry and help us really drive to the next level, so to speak. If I have to play on even the podcast Futureproof, right? You can't be future-proof if you have really an old leadership and old mentality. And in the automotive industry, I mean, I look and I deal with a lot of organizations. When even commercially, I look at a lot of the staff, a lot of the leadership, and quite frankly, we need more young talent. We need to develop that young talent, and we need really, really strong succession planning in the automotive industry. If I look across, I can tell you, quite frankly, and like I said, from a critical eye, we're still a dinosaur. We're still looking at a dinosaur in terms of changing in that perspective. So there's a lot to be learned from other industries that are really enhancing and utilizing young talent, young minds from an innovative perspective. And those are going to be the winners. Those are going to be the ones that catapult their businesses and their industries into the future. But in the automotive industry, we have to do a better job there from a critical perspective.
Okay, in terms of the young leader succession planning and bringing it through, I know that in certain parts of the world, especially within automotive, there's a skill shortage. How do you go about, as an automotive supplier, whether it's tier one or an OEM base, attracting the young talent when you've got, say, some of these tech giants in the Bay Area that are offering them kind of, you could say, more sexy roles in a sense?
Right. Yeah, I think I mean that's a great question, right? I think it all starts from you say entrepreneurship, and I often joke around with the young folks that I mentor is that that's not a new term. So it's almost like within the last 5 years or so, we have a lot of startups, especially in the United States. If I think about Silicon Valley, a lot of the tech startups, as you mentioned, and they say, yeah, entrepreneurship. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be a young entrepreneur. But that's not a new term, right? I think for the most part, what I found to be quite successful at former organizations is the approach to offer young talent the opportunity to work, let's say, in sort of what I call an innovation pod, and that's really with full autonomy. One of the things that I think is a struggle within automotive is that you have a clear hierarchy and an old school model of an organizational chart that's very old school, 1960s, 1970s. I report to the boss reports to someone else, and it's very the hierarchy really destroys the creativity and the innovation that's needed. To attract young talent, I think the key and what starts is that you have to really offer really this entrepreneurship approach within the larger organizations. Really structure your organization to allow innovation without the blocking of a hierarchy. allow folks to operate freely without reporting to 3 or 4 different managers up the chain. Invest and treat that as a startup business within the bigger organization. Those organizations, in my view, Taylor, in automotive that capture and harness that those are the folks that will attract younger talent. Yeah, they'll attract the new innovative minds to come in and help automotive advance in a really good way. Those organizations that are stuck on their hierarchies, that are stuck on, instead of driving what I call a network culture, they're more stuck on org charts and who reports to who and who's the big boss and who's the biggest boss. Those will be the losers. Yeah, the folks that really operate within a network environment and an entrepreneurship sort of environment with these innovation pods for young talent will be the winners. Yeah, and that's really from my approach. And automotive has a long road to climb when it comes to that. And by the way, I make a general comment, but make no mistake, there are some automotive organizations that are doing the right things now, and they're taking that approach. But there's a huge room and opportunity to take advantage of that to attract new talent within the automotive industry. Very important for us.
Okay, and if we, for instance, let's just think of an organisation that maybe the older generation of leadership that may be stuck in their ways. If you was going to step into that organisation, how would you go about approaching the mentality change in the business to make something like that happen, to future-proof that business? What would be kind of the steps you would take?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that you have to naturally break down silos. Yeah, and what I mentioned about the network culture, this is very, very important. Yeah, I often quote really a scholar that I hold dearly, because he's the really, in my view, one of the founding fathers of a lot of leadership and cultural change principles, and this is Dr. Peter Drucker. And Dr. Drucker basically had a famous quote. He says, basically, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, which means that you can have the right strategy, the smartest people. If you don't have the right culture, then 9 times out of 10, that vision or strategy will fail. And I think a part of that, Taylor, is that if you look at the fact that you have to start from the cultural piece, you have to really drive the network attitude. You have to break down those silos. You have to create those pods, what I call innovation pods and entrepreneurship. And you have to, within larger organizations or any organization from that manner, you have to discard the organizational chart. And I know that's difficult. That's a difficult concept for people to grasp, right? How do you come into an organization, but I have a position and I get paid a certain amount of salary? How do I break free from the from the prison of, I would say, of organizational hierarchy? And you have to do that by thinking from a network perspective. That means that you no longer manage the organization from top down. You manage really a 360-degree approach around the organization, and you really have the innovation come from groups that operate within a network. Yeah, that they're not reporting, or they're not somebody boss's boss blocking the innovation. Let the innovators innovate, and give them the room and freedom, and I would say the freedom to act in order to do that. And that's pretty much the approach that I would take. And it starts from there. It starts from really driving the cultural aspects. There's many other things, but it all starts from culture and driving that change, and that change in mindset away from the hierarchy into a network culture.
Okay. And from your point of view, from a management point of view, your management style, how do you go about kind of mentoring and building employees internally so they can grow into these sort of positions and these sort of leaders?
Well, I always approach it from several aspects. The first is always from a high performance mindset. I give people the freedom to act, and the trust needed in order for them to perform at their best and their optimal level. And what that comes is that comes from having an open dialogue, open communication from a leadership perspective in terms of giving really constructive feedback. But more importantly, Taylor, is that it works both ways. Yeah. In a network environment, you also have to welcome that feedback. There's no way the organization grows if you're not able to listen to the voice of the employee. So you talk about the voice of the customer, but within the organization, you have to listen to the voice of the employee. I've been in organizations, some good organizations, and quite frankly, Taylor, to put it quite bluntly, some bad organizations that do not really a good job of harnessing that spirit. And it starts from the top leadership, and it has to be really what I call a tone at the top. The top leadership they have to be open to a culture that really harnesses on feedback, and that has to be a really a network feedback. It can't be just top down a review or performance review. It has to be bottoms up as well, where you're open to do that. And as I mentioned, you have to trust the employees to operate really at a high performer level, and you have to harness that by giving them the freedom to act and the trust behind doing that. So that's always been my approach to leadership, and really driving that. And I always say, trust is essential. It's the foundation of everything. It's a core value to me in business. And it's quite simple, Taylor, in any relationship. If I don't trust you, and if you don't trust me, then we have no relationship. The relationship is built on trust. So I think it starts there. And from a leadership perspective, those are the key things that I would do in driving any organization.
Okay, and then what kind of advice would you give to somebody that's already in the industry, someone that's trying to grow for a company, but want to go on to achieve what you have, led regional organizations, been responsible for huge revenues? What kind of advice would you give that person?
Um, I would say never stop learning, right? I mean, that's the first thing. You don't know everything. If I think about Steve Jobs, one quote that I love by Steve Jobs, he says, I hire smart people for them to tell me what to do, and not for me to tell them what to do. And I truly believe that. I think everyone has to be open to learning and to growing in the organization. That's point number one. Point number two, don't be afraid to take risks. Don't be afraid to go outside of your comfort zone and do something different, or to even start over. And more importantly, don't be afraid to fail. You have to learn from your successes as much as you do. You have to learn even more from things that you failed at. And I would think as long as folks have the open mindset and the open mentality to embrace that, and obviously that comes through embracing change. Change is constant. Change is good. If I think about one of the leaders that I respect, Winston Churchill, was famous, right? He said, "Hey, change is necessary. Change is really a good thing. Change. I welcome change, and those coming into the industry should be prepared." If I think about the ACEs model that I mentioned before, I mean, change is very evident in the automotive industry. In the next decade, we'll see really the next wave of changes to come, not only from a vehicle perspective, from an industry perspective. We talked about change in leadership, Taylor. So all of these things are very, very important. And the advice that I would give is just that: never stop learning. Don't be afraid of failure. Embrace change. Really be a lifelong learner, and really drive forward with an open mindset and an open approach to anything that you do.
Okay, no, and would your advice for somebody, for instance, that's at the University of Michigan, let's say, looking at the automotive industry, unsure whether to go, let's say, to the Silicon Valley side or into automotive, what kind of advice could you give somebody like that right at the start of their journey?
Think about the future. As I mentioned to you, my doctorate degree was in sustainability and sustainable development. I got this doctorate degree over a decade ago. I looked at the future. Yeah, people say, "Man, why that topic, right? Why did you focus on that topic?" And I would say for anybody, for example, coming out of the University of Michigan like myself, I mean, think about the future. Think about the technology in the especially with the automotive sector, the exciting things to come around the changes in autonomous driving, electric vehicles, shared services, connectivity. All of those things are quite interesting and quite frankly, quite sexy for someone that's thinking about a future career. And automotive really harness that energy and open the door for someone that wants to come in and innovate. But once again, Taylor, I really stress to the folks listening to this podcast, hopefully some other leaders that are future proofing their organizations are listening to this as well. And it starts from leadership. So I'm calling on all of the top leaders within the automotive industry to be open to help drive that entrepreneurship and that innovation from our young leaders, and to really focus on your succession planning and making sure you're promoting young leadership within the automotive industry. Super important.
Okay. And for you then, either whether it's now, previously, even coming up in the automotive industry, who would you say your most inspirational leaders have been? And they don't have to be from the industry. It could be anything.
Yeah, if I think about that, Taylor, some I mentioned already, but I'll maybe mention again from a how can I say, a scholarly perspective. I would say Dr. Peter Drucker. Why is that? Really, he's to me the foundation of a lot of the principles that you have in basic culture change and leadership principles. And a lot of those things are not new. They were really built off a lot of the teachings that he had, a lot of the books that you read today. If you go back to Dr. Peter Drucker, you'll find a lot of those concepts really taken and expounded from his platform. If I think about from a, how can I say, business perspective, I'm really a fan of Jack Welch. I think from that perspective, his tenacity and driving of execution was really good in this turnaround of GE. So I look from those past models and a lot of the things that I read on Jack Welch as well. I respect that his tenacity. If I think about from a let's say political and military perspective, Winston Churchill, like I said, I think very bold. If I think about President Barack Obama, more recently, I think against all odds, if I have to summarize that, to achieve the level of success he's achieved as the first African American president of the United States, that's quite phenomenal, and from my perspective. And if I think about someone I believe that stands on their principles, another military leader that I admire is General Colin Powell. Yeah, from that perspective. If I think about leadership from a social justice perspective, Dr. Martin Luther King led a transformation that's really talked about to this day. But really, if you think back, Taylor, about the time that was done, that was very bold from a social justice perspective. And then if I think about from a practical perspective, hey, my mom, yeah, my mom raising four kids. I grew up from a humble background. I didn't grow up with much, and my mom made a way out of no way. So she was really my hero in terms of providing for the family and helping us through hard times, difficult times, and struggling. And I never saw my mother give up. And to this day, my mom is my biggest hero.
No, that's great to hear. And if we look at then the other side of it, you're mentoring employees, growing employees through businesses. During your career, have you had that mentorship, somebody you've looked up to within the industry that's helped you grow?
Sure. I had a number of mentors along the way. I don't want to slight anyone, so I don't name names, but that's very important, Taylor. That's why it's super important to me to embrace mentorship. I'm willing to mentor anyone that wants to lend me an ear, right? That's really, and as I mentioned before, you said what advice would I have for someone entering the industry is to be open to learn, be open to listen, and to be open to those mentorship and those relationships. And I can say there's no way I would be where I am today without having those folks that I can bounce ideas off of or get their advice or really get some sort of counsel and direction on how they would approach different things. Those relationships are super important, and I would highly encourage folks to embrace mentorship in the industry.
Okay, yeah. And then one question I always end the podcast on, Don, is what do you want to be remembered for? What do you want the legacy of Don James to look like within the industry and also without?
Wow, that's a really good question. Yeah. If I had to think about it, Taylor, it all starts from my purpose. And that's really what drives me beyond automotive. And like I said, I'm in the leadership business, and it's driven by my purpose. My purpose is to help people, whether that helping people from a career perspective, from an advice perspective, for sharing different wisdoms that I learned along the way. That's very important for me. From a developmental perspective, I always put my efforts into helping people. And how I would want to be remembered is, I would say, hey, Dr. James was a person that was an authentic leader, and he practiced authenticity in his approach. That means he never gave me advice that he wouldn't take. And generally speaking, he did his best to help me and to help the industry and leadership grow. And that's what I would want to be remembered for, is really fulfilling my purpose.
No, Don, and I think that's great. And I can say I've extremely enjoyed the conversation today, really getting the insight into leadership and being in the leadership business, should I say. So I think the listeners would have learnt a lot from today, and I have to admit, I have too. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Don.
Yep. Thank you, Taylor, from my side as well.